51 days. That was the contract. 51 days doing electrical work on a pipeline relay station in western Montana, no cell service most of the time, and a per diem that would cover 3 months of my son's college fund if I stretched it right. I'd done longer hauls before. This one felt manageable. I kissed my wife goodbye on a Tuesday morning in late June. My son was still asleep. He was 15, and 15-year-olds don't wake up before 9 if they can help it. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Be good. Love you, kid. Back before school starts. I figured that was enough. It wasn't. My name doesn't matter much for the story. What matters is that I'm a father, and I failed to see what was happening in my own house before I left. My wife, I'll call her by what she was to me then, my wife, had been talking for about 6 months about our son Grayson. He was struggling. That part was true. His grades had slipped junior year into freshman year of high school. He'd quit the baseball team without explanation, and he'd started keeping his bedroom door shut in a way that felt different from normal teenage privacy. More like he was trying to disappear. She showed me a pamphlet sometime in May. A place called Ridgeline Pathways. She described it as a therapeutic boarding program for adolescent boys. Structured. Outdoors-based. She said a woman from her church group had sent her son there 2 years ago, and he'd come back a completely different kid. I remember looking at the pamphlet and thinking it looked expensive. I asked if we could try a regular therapist first. She said we had. She reminded me that Grayson had walked out of 2 sessions and refused to go back. I remembered that too. I said I'd think about it. Then the Montana job came in, and the money was too good to pass on, and somewhere in the weeks before I left, the conversation about Ridgeline Pathways went quiet. I assumed it had passed. I assumed we'd agreed, without saying it out loud, that we'd figure something else out. I was wrong about that. Day 33, the foreman on our crew, a heavy-set guy from Idaho named Bert, made a judgment call that ended the job early. A section of conduit had been laid wrong by the previous contractor, and the whole relay station had to be re-permitted before we could finish. Nothing to do but go home. Bert gave us our hours, our checks, and a handshake, and that was that. I drove 16 hours straight with 1 stop for gas and a bad cup of coffee outside Billings. I got home at 4 in the morning and let myself in quietly because I figured Grayson would be asleep and I didn't want to wake the house. The kitchen light was on. My wife was at the table with her laptop open. She started when she saw me, not the normal startle of someone surprised by their husband coming home. Something tighter, something that looked like a person calculating how much time they had. "You're back early," she said. "Job fell through. Permit issue." I set my bag down. "Where's Grayson?" She closed the laptop before I could see what was on it. "He's at a program," she said. "Ridgeline Pathways. We talked about it." I stood there for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went by. "We talked about it as a maybe," I said. "I never agreed. You never disagreed either. And he needed help. I made a decision." "When did he leave?" 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. My son had been somewhere in the mountains of southern Utah for 3 weeks while I was laying conduit in Montana, thinking he was at home sleeping past 9 and eating cereal out of the box. "I want the address," I said. She hesitated just long enough that I noticed. "They don't recommend unannounced visits. There's an adjustment period. I want the address of where my son is." She gave it to me. I don't think she had a choice. And I think she knew that. I slept 3 hours, showered, and was back in the truck by 8 in the morning. The drive to the location listed for Ridgeline Pathways was 4 hours and 40 minutes according to my phone. I made it in 4. The property was down a red dirt road off a 2-lane highway that didn't have a name, just a county route number. No signage at the turnoff. I drove past it twice before I found it. There was a gate with a keypad, and beyond the gate, a cluster of low buildings and, farther back, what I can only describe as working farmland. Rows of something green under white shade cloth. A greenhouse the size of a warehouse. A man in a polo shirt came out of the main building before I'd even finished parking. He had a clipboard and a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for my son, Grayson." The smile didn't change. "Are you on the visitation schedule?" "No." "We do ask that family members schedule visits in advance. It's part of the therapeutic model. Unstructured contact during the first phase can." "I'm his father," I said. "I didn't authorize his placement. I want to see him now." He asked me to come inside and speak with the program director, a woman named Dr. Voss. Her office smelled like cedar and had framed certificates on every wall. She explained the program's philosophy with the calm confidence of someone who had given this speech many times. Structured environment, accountability, physical labor as a therapeutic modality, character development, delayed gratification. I sat in the chair across from her desk and I asked one question. "Are the kids being paid for the physical labor?" She paused for the first time. "The program uses farm work as part of the therapeutic curriculum. It teaches." "That's not what I asked. Are the kids receiving wages for their work?" Another pause. "The work is part of the program fee, which the parents pay," I said. "So the kids are doing farm labor, the parents are paying for the program, and the farm work is not compensated. Is that correct?" She picked up her phone and said she needed to bring in their legal coordinator. I told her I didn't need to speak to their legal coordinator. I needed to see my son. They brought Grayson into a small conference room with a window that looked out over the parking lot. He walked in ahead of a staff member who stayed in the doorway. I saw him before he saw me, and I had about 2 seconds to absorb what I was looking at. He was thin, not in the way teenagers sometimes get thin when they hit a growth spurt. Thin in the way that means something is wrong. His wrists, when he moved, looked too narrow for his arms. His face had a drawn quality around the jaw. There was a scab on his lower lip where it had cracked and dried in the sun, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there in June. He looked up, and when he saw me, something happened in his face that I'm not going to be able to describe fully. It was like watching someone remember something they had stopped letting themselves believe. "Dad." I went to him and put my arms around him, and he grabbed on in a way he hadn't done since he was maybe 9 or 10 years old. His shoulder blades felt sharp under my hands. After a minute, he pulled back and looked at me and said, very quietly, so the staff member in the doorway couldn't hear clearly, "Dad, they told me you both signed the forms. They said you knew." I felt something drop out of my chest. "I didn't sign anything," I said. "I didn't know you were here." He nodded slowly, like he was deciding whether to let himself believe that. "I wrote you a letter," he said. 2 weeks ago, they said they mailed it." I had received no letter. "They read the letters before they send them," he said. "One of the older kids told me the ones they don't like, they don't send." I straightened up and turned to the staff member in the doorway. "I'm taking my son home." The staff member, a young man who looked barely old enough to be out of college himself, said he'd need to get Dr. Voss. "Go get whoever you need," I said. Dr. Voss came back with the legal coordinator, a man in a gray shirt who introduced himself as their compliance officer. He had a folder. He explained that both parents had signed an enrollment agreement, that the agreement included provisions about removal requiring consent from both custodial parents, and that removing Grayson without my wife's consent would place me in potential violation of the contract and possibly constitute interference with a custodial arrangement. I had driven 4 hours and 40 minutes and slept 3 hours in the last 2 days. And I was listening to a man tell me I needed my wife's permission to take my son home. "Is my son free to leave if he chooses?" I asked. The compliance officer looked at Dr. Voss. "He's a minor in a supervised therapeutic. He's 15 years old and he's standing right here, and I'm asking whether he is being physically detained. Yes or no?" No one answered that question. I looked at Grayson. "Go get your things." He looked at the staff member, then back at me, and then he walked out of the room. No one stopped him. I think they understood in that moment that stopping him physically was a line they weren't prepared to cross with me standing there. While Grayson was collecting his belongings, I walked to the window that faced the back of the property. The greenhouse I'd seen from the road was about a quarter mile away. I could see figures moving inside through the translucent panels. Kids, teenagers, walking rows, bending down, standing back up. How many kids are in the program currently? I asked. Dr. Voss said that information was confidential. I counted what I could see through the glass. At least a dozen silhouettes. Grayson came back with a duffel bag that wasn't full. He'd gone in with 2 bags, he told me later. The second one, he said, had disappeared within the first week. They told him it had been moved to storage but never said where. We walked through the lobby toward the front door. The compliance officer followed, still talking about the contract, about liability, about my wife's authorization. I kept walking. At the door, Grayson stopped and turned back. There was a boy sitting on a bench near the reception desk. Maybe 12 years old, smaller than any 12-year-old I'd seen in a while, with grass-stained knees and the same hollow look around the eyes. Grayson looked at me. "Dad, that's Micah. He's been here longer than anyone. His parents live in Oregon. He told me once he doesn't think they're coming." I looked at the boy. He was watching us with an expression that wasn't hope exactly, more like a person who had learned to be careful with hope. I looked back at Grayson. "Go wait by the truck," I said. I went back to Dr. Voss's office. I told her that I was going to make 2 phone calls in the parking lot before I left. The first was to the Utah Division of Child and Family Services. The second was to a journalist at a regional paper who I'd met once at a community meeting and who I had no actual relationship with, but I said it like I did. I told her I would make both calls whether she changed anything or not, but that what I reported would depend heavily on what I observed in the next 10 minutes. I don't know exactly what happened after I walked out. I know that before I finished my first call, which was real, not bluffed, a different staff member had sat down next to Micah on that bench and was using a landline to make a call of her own. I found out later that Micah's parents had not been called in 3 weeks. They thought he was in school. Grayson and I drove north out of Utah with the windows down and the radio off. For the first hour, neither of us said much. He ate 2 protein bars I had in the center console and half a bag of trail mix, and then fell asleep against the window like he hadn't slept deeply in weeks. I let him sleep. When he woke up somewhere outside of Provo, he told me about the schedule. Up at 5:30. Breakfast was 20 minutes, then field work until noon. Lunch was 30 minutes. Then either greenhouse work or construction on the back cabins until dinner. After dinner, a group session they called Accountability Circle, where kids were expected to confess to negative behaviors they'd exhibited during the day. If they didn't confess voluntarily, other kids were encouraged to report on them. They called it community accountability, Grayson said, but it basically meant you couldn't trust anyone because anything you said could end up in the circle. He told me that one boy, a 16-year-old named Danny, had tried to leave on foot on his second week. They brought him back and put him in what they called a reset protocol for 4 days, which meant he ate alone, slept in a separate room, and was not permitted to speak to other residents. They didn't hit anyone, Grayson said. I want to be clear about that. They didn't hit anyone. But it didn't feel like help. It felt like control. He looked out the window. I kept thinking I must have done something really wrong for you guys to send me somewhere like that. I had to focus on the road for a minute. You didn't do anything wrong, I said, and I didn't send you there. I didn't know. I know that now, he said. I believe you. He was quiet for a while. Dad? Yeah. Micah's parents. Do you think they'll actually come? I made the call, I said. The right people know now. Yes, I think they'll come. He nodded and went back to watching the desert pass. What happened over the next several months I'll compress because some of it is still moving through the legal system, and I was asked to be careful about specifics. Utah DCFS opened an investigation within 48 hours of my call. A second complaint had been filed 2 weeks earlier by the family of another former resident, so the agency already had a file. The investigation found that residents were performing an average of 6 to 8 hours of uncompensated labor per day on a working farm that sold produce commercially. The program had been collecting program fees of up to $9,000 per month per student, while simultaneously profiting from the students' labor. There were no licensed therapists on staff. The counselors had certificates from a private organization that was not recognized by any state licensing board. Dr. Voss and the two principal operators of Ridgeline Pathways were charged with several counts, including child labor violations and operating without proper licensing. I don't know what the outcome of those charges will be yet. My wife and I did not stay married. I want to say that without embellishment, she believed, genuinely, that she was doing the right thing for Grayson. She had been frightened by who he was becoming, or who she thought he was becoming, and she had been convinced by a well-packaged lie that this place could fix something that wasn't even broken the way she thought. I understand that. Understanding it doesn't mean we could come back from it. Grayson lived with me. He started seeing a real therapist, a woman he actually liked, who had an office with a cactus on the windowsill and didn't ask him to confess anything to anyone. He went back to school in September. He quit one elective and picked up another, woodshop, and came home once with a small step stool he'd made from scrap pine that he set in the kitchen doorway without saying anything about it. It's still there. Some nights I'd catch him standing at the window after dinner, just looking out at the backyard, and I didn't know if he was processing or just being 15. And I learned that sometimes the right thing is to not ask, to just be in the same room, to let him know the room is safe without making a ceremony out of it. He asked me once, about 4 months after I brought him home, if I thought what happened to him would have happened if I hadn't come back early. I didn't answer right away. The truck, I finally said. The job fell through because of a permit error on conduit that was laid wrong before we even got there. Nothing to do with me. I just happened to be the one who came home. He thought about that. So it was luck, he said. A lot of important things are, I said. He went back to his homework. I stood in the kitchen for a while after, thinking about that foreman in Montana, about a conduit that was laid wrong by a contractor 2 years ago, about how a mistake made by a stranger in a field I'd never set foot on was the reason my son came home. I think about Micah too. His family did come. His mother called me about 6 weeks after she got my number from the agency. She cried on the phone and I didn't know what to say, so I just told her I was glad she knew. I was glad she came. She said Micah had asked about the man who stopped on his way out and went back inside. I told her to tell him I was just a dad who came home early. That's all. That's the whole thing. I came home early, I saw my son, and I did what any father would do. The fact that it turned into what it turned into, the investigation, the charges, the other families, I don't think of that as something I did. I think of it as something that was already there, waiting to be seen. The step stool Grayson made is still in the kitchen doorway. I don't move it. There's a step stool in my kitchen doorway that Grayson made from scrap pine and woodshop glass. He set it there without saying anything, and I've never moved it. I think about that step stool more than I probably should. What I keep coming back to is this. The conduit that ended my job in Montana was laid wrong by a contractor 2 years before I ever got there. A stranger's mistake, in a field I'll never see, on a job that had nothing to do with me. And that mistake is the reason I drove home 18 days early. That's the reason I walked into my kitchen at 4 in the morning and saw my wife close her laptop before I could see the screen. That's the reason Grayson came home. I used to think the hard part of being a father was the big moments. The decisions you see coming. The ones you can prepare for. I know now that the hard part is the slow drift. The way a family can be pulling in different directions by inches, so gradually that you don't notice until you're already a long way from where you started. I was working in Montana because the money was good. That part was true, but I was also, if I'm being honest, more comfortable with a clear job and a defined timeline than I was with whatever was happening at home with Grayson. The closed door. The quiet. The way he'd stopped being easy to reach. It was easier to go to Montana than to sit in that discomfort and figure out what it meant. That's the thing nobody tells you about being wrong. It's rarely a single moment of bad judgment. It's usually a series of small choices that each felt reasonable in isolation. What I understand now, on the other side of everything that happened, is that Grayson needed something specific from me that year. Not discipline, not a program, not intervention with a pamphlet attached. He needed me to sit down across from him and be willing to be uncomfortable, to not require him to explain himself before I'd commit to showing up. That's not something you can outsource. That's not something a facility in Utah can provide on your behalf, regardless of what the paperwork says. There's a version of what happened where I stayed in Montana, where the conduit was laid correctly by that contractor 2 years ago, where I finished the job, come home in August, and Grayson is still somewhere in the desert learning to not trust anyone in a room they call an accountability circle. I try not to sit with that version too long, but I don't let myself forget it either, because the difference between those two outcomes wasn't my wisdom or my foresight. It was luck. And luck is not a plan. What I took from this, what I carry every day, is that the willingness to see clearly, even when what you're seeing is your own failure, is the only thing that actually protects the people you love. Not strength alone, not good intentions alone, but the honest, disciplined work of paying attention, of asking the next question, of not accepting a comfortable answer when something in you knows it's incomplete. Grayson is doing better, not fixed. I don't think that's the right word for a person, but moving forward in the way that matters. He's learning to trust slowly, which is, I think, the only healthy way to do it after what he went through. And I'm learning to stay in the room when things are hard, instead of finding a reason to leave. The step stool is still in the doorway. I walk past it every morning. I don't need it to remind me, but I'm glad it's there.